right, good evening and welcome to this edition of Tertulia at LATEA. Tonight with us, I have the poet, professor, actor, so many things, José Angel Figueroa. Buenas noches, José Angel, how are you?
Buenas noches, ¿cómo está Miguel, hermano?
Doing very good here. Wish I had my hat on like you do, and I love the getup. Love the getup.
It's part of the persona.
All right. Well, before we start delving into that persona and exchanging a lively conversation, as we like to do here, I want to read to you a few things about José Angel Figueroa, who I used to teach beside at Boricua College some years ago, back in the early 2000s. So for me, it's a very special interview, talk, whatever we can call these tertulias. And José Angel Hart's from Mayaguez, but he grew up in the Southeast Bronx here in New York. And like I said, besides being a poet and a professor, he's also been an actor, an editor, and of course, an activist also. And his powerful social commentaries grace a lot of his books, bringing up the Latinx experience and, signaling some thoughts about the colonial oppression in Puerto Rico and in the United States. Some of his books are The Invisibles, written with George Malave, A Mirror in My Own Backstage, Un Espejo en Mi Propio Bastidor, that's the translation, Hypocrisy Held Hostage, my favorite title of all of them. Oh, wow, look at that. Oh, the cover is
with George Malave.
What a beautiful piece. Noo Jork and East 110th Street, his first book. Yes. So I don't want to belabor the biography too much because you'll get a sense of José Angel in his own words here. And José Angel, you heard from Mayaguez, la Sultana del Oeste here in Puerto Rico, and then your family, like so many of our families, moved to New York, and you grew up in the Southeast Bronx. What do you remember most about your childhood in Puerto Rico before you headed to the States?
I got very concerned with Mama. Used to talk about the bombings in Puerto Rico, and they were hunting for the independentistas and just arresting everybody who believe in not in the independence of the island, but the independence of a people. And then in 52 or 53, when the Commonwealth came to be, my mother thought it was the best time for us because of health issues in my family with my sisters, and of course employment and education. So we came here.
How old were you right then when you moved?
I was about 9 years old, and I felt I was stolen, uprooted, because I have such beautiful memories as a child in Puerto Rico, and I was born in El Seco, Mayaguez, in that area. And, but we had to leave because my father was also a political activist. I didn't know this till way after, in my 30s, about my father's life. And he got imprisoned for being pro-independence. So in that time, and still today, if you are involved in the politics of independence of a people to decolonize the island, you get targeted, and so does your family. You lose your job, they lose their job. So that's the reason about 52, 53, that my mother came here without speaking so much English. And we got lucky because in the day that we came, the cousin who was supposed to receive us was still working when we got there from the airport. Long story short, her husband made us feel like we shouldn't be there, that we were invading his space. And my mother was a very proud woman. So she took the 5 of us outside in the cold, and we were still wearing tropical clothes. And then this woman saw us, and within 2 to 3 hours took us to social services. So on the first day, on Bruckner Expressway and 3rd Avenue, right across the 3rd Avenue Bridge, that is where we moved. This is the house. right on Brooklyn, 134th Street, right across. And un jíbaro that was growing corn. Later in 73, when I published my first book, I put on the overall because where I moved, this jíbaro was growing corn in the front stoop. Look at it.
Wow. Wow.
And that became the cover for my first book because it's all in search of a wholeness. You know, and when we leave the island, we become like freestyle self exiles, you know, because we have to adapt not only to the language and the culture, but in many ways, to master the English language, we tend to forget the Spanish that came with it. You know, so it was a tug of war between Spanish as my cultural heritage, which we spoke at home, and learning English in school, because if you didn't master English, you were literally pushed out of the system. So it's not that we hated school, they taught us to hate school in the way they taught us, and they wanted us to drop out. So when I learned that, I started searching for books about us in the library. They kept telling me that you don't have any books. So when my homies were doing stickball and trying to become romantics and all that stuff and football, I got lost in the library, searching for the dictionary and the thesaurus to master the English language. And that's where I discover Vallejo and Neruda and Lorca. I said, oh, wait a minute, we have some Latino poets. So I always felt that the school system then, because they were not trained or educated about who we were as newcomers, you know, but I was always searching for the literature. And my mother always gave me books.
Mm-hmm.
Because she knew that I had this hunger for books, you know, at that age. And here I decided, hey, you know what? If you're not going to tell my story and I'm going to hide in the library to search for my wholeness, I'm going to start writing about it as well. And that's what I've been doing.
So that's where the impulse to write comes from, that in that change, because obviously you exhibit, or right now you talk about a criticality. When you change ambiances, when you change places, you start comparing, you start acknowledging the difference, the hardships, the whatever, the lacks, as well as the losses, right? You're saying we were stolen. So
It was the refusal to be invisible.
right. And so the refusal to be invisible, at what age is what starts generating the impulse to write, you would say? Like when do you start writing?
When I fell in love with women.
Okay. So teenager, when you
I
were a
was
teenager.
tongue-tied. I was tongue-tied as a young kid because I used to stutter. And then I realized if I wrote secret poems and put them under their desk or in between their books when they weren't looking, it was a way of me playing Cyrano, you know, with or without the nose. And I got used to writing, and because I didn't want to feel that I was voiceless, you know. And then as we started writing in the 60s, mainstream publishers want to reduce our literature to being ghettoized, you know, or ethnic, or not relevant or important to mainstream literature because it wasn't white enough, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
so on. So all these factors played a role in the rebel being born at home who became a left-handed poet.
Left-handed poet. Well, I want to read for our viewers, and so you can comment on it. Something that you mentioned back in 2016 when you were a speaker in a panel organized by CUNY. The theme was comparative militarization and narratives of healing. And I read in his presentation, he tells that when he was in 5th grade, the teacher physically punished him for speaking Spanish. He then was taken to the assistant principal office, and there he was punished as well. His mother was called to the office. Not fully understanding what was going on, she assumed that Jose Angel was misbehaving and slapped him. Later at home, you explained to her what had happened. You say that she apologized to you, and the next day went back to the classroom, confronted the teacher vehemently, and warned her in broken English never to touch her son again. Could that be the genesis before the girl craze that really liberated your soul and your voice?
No, that was elementary school.
Okay.
Girl crazy is when you were in junior high school.
I know. So that's what I'm saying. This was the first explosion prior to the ultimate liberation of the tongue, if you will, or of writing, when you are confronted with your love of women, of girls, or whatever.
But let me backtrack a little bit with the teacher. Her name was Miss Schaefer, at a time that Puerto Ricans were drinking Schaefer beer. Now, what happened was, when I came into the classroom, I didn't understand the word homework. So I asked a student next to me, ¿Qué quiere decir homework? And she heard me speak Spanish. Miss Schaefer was a tall teacher, about 6'1", with a beehive blonde haircut like in The Bride of Frankenstein. And I fell in love with that woman because I never seen such a tall woman in my entire life. And then she came over to me, and when she heard me speak Spanish, she took her long fingernails, held my hand, and scratched me from top down. And I didn't cry aloud, but inside I was crying because she was torturing me for speaking Spanish. Then she took me to the assistant principal, who had like a Marine haircut, those guys.
It's a miracle you didn't become a hairdresser with this memory for hair.
That's close. But the other thing was that the assistant principal rolled up a newspaper and hit me on the head, told me to sit down. All because, and he said, Spanish is bad for you. Do not speak it again. So they had me in those biology labs that had 3 boards, write for 3 weeks. And I was a lefty, and they forced me with my right hand to write, Spanish is bad for me. I will not speak it again.
Wow.
In 3 huge blackboards.
Oh my God.
That was the experience that said, okay, this is now, education is now warfare. And that's where I had to start writing. So the thing about the girls and all that was later on, when you felt you did have a voice, and writing poetry was a way of connecting, with people.
What about you mentioned some of great poets like Vallejo, you did mention Neruda. So at that point, when this happened, the incident with the teachers, and then going on to your adolescence, for a little later, the girls, what are you reading? I mean, what are you reading as a very young man, or like as a kid growing into an adolescent? What are you reading?
Well, the connection I saw with Lorca was when he got himself uprooted in 1929 and had this dreamlike romantic view of America. And ironically, he came to New York City and Columbia University when the Depression hit. And the idea of people in lines waiting to eat food, and everybody looked like decrepit and poor, and like, they just came from a tour of hell. Here's a romantic poet who wrote about gypsy ballads and pastoral literature and the beauty of nature, and talking to the winds in Puerto Rico, and the whole duende thing of spirituality and poetics. And he influenced me because when he uprooted himself and came to New York was hell at that time. So his poetry and Poet in New York and all this changed because he was now in connection with his Afro roots. And that became a connection with me in terms of my connection to my ancestral African roots, which was often denied in our home, because of colorism. Ah, tú eres un negro, tú eres un prietito. I said, wait a minute. So I was already at home, un prietito, un negro, and my nickname as a child was Prieto, until 10 years old when I came here, Prieto, because I was always out in the sun, and it was all about,
Trigueño, un trigueño.
So we had these words that are, you know, euphemisms for, you know, you're Indian, Toreta, you know how to work, you're not African, you know. And so I said, no, there's something wrong here because of our ancestry is a hybrid of these cultures, you know, from the Taino to the Africans, etc., to the Europeans, not just the Spanish, and so on. So all that search for your identity, and then Lorca, Neruda, all these, they were vagabonds. They were cultural visionaries and vagabonds who, you know, but went beyond their roots and went to different planets and wrote such beautiful stuff. That's the connection I saw as the poet, not only as a cultural historian or visual historian, but also as a poet or vagabond, and I say that in the most positive terms, that's always out there in search of your roots, you know, making connections with your ancestors. But it was people also like Don Ricardo Alegría, who's like a mentor and father figure to me, uh, who, you know, introduced me to the whole Taino out of work culture, and that's that passionate thing of being a cultural nationalist was who I became during the 60s all the way up to the 80s, you know.
Well,
And I had to write that story because who's going to write it if the poet doesn't? So part of the thing about the Latino literature is we need to explore more what is the role of the poet in our culture. You know, they're not that just sideshow during some cultural revolution that you play like mambo and all that and play with an orchestra. We played a very important role in the history of Puerto Rico, you know, from Lola Rodriguez de Teo and La Boriqueña to Julia de Burgos, and I could go on and on and on.
Well, but I just wanted to touch base. So I know you have a bachelor's degree in English literature and education from NYU. You went to for your master's in writing in SUNY Buffalo. But so before
Yeah, and
that,
Fordham University.
and for them and before you get there, you're already reading Garcia Lorca and Neruda and Vallejo. Before that, you're in your high school years, you're already getting exposed to Poeta Nueva York and Lorca, or did that happen in college?
No, I was exposed to Puerto Rican literature at home. We used
Wonderful.
to have Tertulia, Bembe at home every weekend, going to mom and grandma's house. And these poets read, uh, you know, all the poets in Puerto Rico. Give me some names because now I'm fading now on the famous.
Luis Lloren Torre, Palesmato,
There
tú
you go.
sabes. Right,
Yeah,
right.
Julia. And they read it like, you know, so while people were falling in love with Elvis Presley, I was falling in love with the literature of Puerto Rico because we're natural born storytellers. And my uncles always read this literature and they always had a story to go with it. And that's where my introduction to literature was. And you know what? When I was in my 30s, I found this huge box of writings and it was my mother's. I said, Ma, yo no sabía que tú escribías poesía. Dice, sí, pero yo escribo poesía como una ardilla. I write like a squirrel. And it's true, I was
Hidden
hot.
gems,
Huh?
hidden gems,
Yeah.
hidden gems.
So I learned that she was, and then my father's mother, my grandma Felipa, who was a philosopher, was the one that turned me on to storytelling. So all that was already in my DNA before I knew it. You know, it was
Wow. So
already sinking into my skin. You know, plus I wanted to become an actor, and because I was a natural born show off at home, I still am.
hey, the costumes tell the story. You're
Ahí viene
there,
el
you're there.
charlatán.
Well, so all of a sudden, I'm getting all the, you know, a picture of this fertile sort of soil, you know, that's transplanted from Puerto Rico, from Mayaguez to 110th Street, or you know, to the Bronx, and then you're also having some kind of tertulias. They're nurturing this sort of family gift, and all of a sudden you end up meeting three renowned American writers, three monsters, right? In your college years or in your master's: Robert Bly, John Logan, Robert Creeley. Uh, what's your
Max
relation?
Wickett, Gary Snyder, Yeah, John Logan was my professor at SUNY Buffalo, where I got to meet Ginsberg and Gary Snyder and all these guys that were getting into Buddhism and Hinduism and spirituality. And they were fascinated with the fact that Puerto Ricans were also spiritualists. Because I grew up with a family of Peretita, you know, and all
Right.
that. And they were fascinated. But the whole idea was that I've always used Latin rhythms and jazz in my work. And then as an actor, meaning interpreting and impersonating my work as an actor, because too many poets are such, they're beautiful, but they're completely bored when they're reading their work because there's
Oh,
no
yeah.
intonation, no reflection. And they just like, you might as well read to mannequins,
Yeah, but you come from a rich tradition of tú sabes, yeah, of
and theater.
declamadores, declamadores.
Exactly, declamadores. So I grew up with that, and when I was with theater, I was mentored by Miriam Colon. Raúl Julia was my teacher. You know, I got to meet Jose Ferrer, which was one of my heroes, and then joined with Pedro Santaliz at Teatro Pobre de America because I wanted to keep my Spanish, and that was the only way to be in Spanish theater, or what they called at the time the living theater, created by Miriam Colon, Pedro Santaliz, and quite a few others, and so on. Worked with Maria Romero, among other great actors at the time, and so that enabled me to hold on to my Spanish, but at the same time, my cultural history in Puerto Rico, because
So
we
did the
can't afford to
Buffalo,
be invisible to ourselves, and we always need to be connected to the homeland or the island.
but the Buffalo crew, like people like Bly and Logan and Creeley, if that is indeed the Buffalo crew, were you already working with Santa Elise and Miriam and those people, or did that happen after you met those poets? Were they mentors in some way, shape, or form? I mean, the North Americans.
Yeah, no, Creeley, John Logan, they came before because I got a writing fellowship to teach in the first Puerto Rican studies program in SUNY Buffalo, 1969-70. Pedro was also with me. And because I already was being published, one of the criteria to be an adjunct and get this fellowship was to be a published author. So
And
I
you
was
did
at
your
the
first
right
book in
place.
73, right? You had your first book published in 73, I believe.
Yeah, I was completing my academic life at NYU, where I got a full scholarship um, under Dr. Roscoe Brown, who's one of the Tuscany pilots, and he was the head of the African American Institute, and he recruited me and got me from Morris High School to NYU, and I got a full 7-year scholarship, room and board, because I was culturally deprived.
Okay. Little did they know the Trojan
Oh,
horse they let in.
and they told me I could go to NYU bookstore and get any books I wanted and as many. I got the biggest books I could find. And so Creeley and all these guys in the post beat poets had an influence on me, but it was really radical poets and militant poets and activists like Amiri Baraka, Piri Thomas in 67 with Down These Mean Streets. And of course, a lot of my contemporaries like Pietri, Luis Reyes Rivera, one of my favorite poets, Tony Medina, Sandra Maria Esteves, Mina Nieves. I mean, I could go on. There's a long list. Susana Caban, that's in Puerto Rico. We all learn from each other in terms of our involvement with the Nuyorican Poets Café on 6th Street, the original Poets Cafe, for 15 years because they had a 15, 18-year hiatus before they went to 3rd Street. So
Okay.
I was part of the original Poets Cafe on 6th Street, and that's where we learned our craft. You wouldn't dare get on stage unless you had your act together
Right.
because the audience was interactive. But if they didn't like what you were doing, man, take a walk, and
There
come
was
back.
hell to pay. There was hell to pay.
Yeah, so it was like our audition, and we were so hungry to be recognized. But you could never call yourself a poet unless other poets identify you as such. It
When did
wasn't
you,
white publishers and books. It was about if you work with those contemporaries and they say, wow, check out this poet. That's when I felt more comfortable that I was, doing something that was my skin, my inner skin.
oh, like the respect of your peers seems to have been the publishing press. What about Amiri
And the
Baraka?
political climate of the times created us. That's where the whole Nuyoricanism came in. In 1958, Jaime Carrero, an artist as well, who was the head of the art department in Interamerica in San Germán, he coined the term Nuyorican, except at that time the term neo, N-E-New, meant nueva voz. And it was poets who came from the island who wrote predominantly in Spanish but had to learn to think in English.
Right.
We were the reverse. We were poets writing in English who now had to get back into thinking in Spanish. But Nueva Voz was from the 30s to the 50s, and then the term Nuyorican meant something else from the mid 60s all the way up to the 80s.
Hmm.
But it was about poets who wrote in Spanish and writers like Pedro Juan Soto, etc., who wrote in Spanish, and then we were craving for the works in English because, most of us had lost the Spanish while mastering English. So that we had to go back and forth like a wave to reinvent ourselves.
When I have a personal, curiosity, when did you first meet Amiri Baraka, and tell us a little bit about your exchanges with Amiri?
Um, the New York State Council of the Art hired me as a language arts consultant to do a review of his presentation at the Nuyorican Poets Café. So I wrote an essay on the birth of Neoricanism and the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, and he had a play called Tonton de Lorraine Fist Fight in Heaven, you know. So I went there to review his work, and I also got to perform, and he loved a piece called A Conversation with Coca-Cola that became my crossover poem, just like Pedro Pietri's Puerto Rican obituary became his crossover poem. So we all had to do that where there was a piece where somebody, oh man, now check this out. So Mary loved A Conversation with Coca-Cola. And we've been intimate friends. He's been like a mentor and a big brother for me then and now. God bless him. So he became an influence because when he performed, he was a jazz instrument. And I said, oh, that's what I want to do. I want to play with music. I don't want to be the poet reading a poem. I want to be the actor impersonating the poet as a character. And that allowed me as an actor to not own my work when I perform it, but to give it flesh and give it a new life. And this is what I was saying before about poets who are brilliant, but they don't know how to deliver their poems to an audience. They're like the audience say, oh, I see, you want me to listen to you. And they compete with the poem itself. A poet cannot afford to overshadow his or her poetry when they're performing. So as an actor, it gave me that freedom, that spontaneousness, not to read or recite, but to put flesh and rhythm and voice and intonation and character and temperament and emotional intelligence and politics into my work. And that's how the poet actor came to be in my style. And there are poets like Luis Reyes Rivera, who I consider to be one of the greatest poets of the century, besides Pietri and others, that when he read, he just transformed the page, and he turned English into a masterpiece, because English could be very boring, but Puerto Ricans, my purpose is to Puerto Ricanize America through my poetry by using imagery and metaphor or visualization. And artists like yourself, like Juan Sanchez, or Walter Velez, Rudy Gutierrez, who did the cover of my book, and you know, yeah. And by the way, I wanna, if it's okay to plug, I want to give credit to Iris Morales, the founder and executive editor of Red Sugarcane Press that created this new press, and I was the first published poet in this new press, Red Sugarcane Press. Now, if the red doesn't tell you anything, I don't know what will, because that's her color, you know?
But
And
this
she's a
is the
bona fide communist.
this is the latest book, and I want to go into this a little later because I want to just bring up the fact that, you know, east of 110th Street, of 110th Street, your first book was
Right.
published in 1973, right when the Nuyorican Poets Café began. So I'm appreciating the synergy of you starting as a young poet, just as this movement takes hold, and the fact that you are one of the, you know, a key member, a torchbearer, one of the survivors, because we've lost, you know, some of the key
We
figures
lost over
have passed away.
95% of those writers.
Yes,
You
yes,
know,
yes.
and that's sad. That's sad because we all think we're going to live forever, but you know, forever is yesterday. It's not
Right,
tomorrow.
right.
You know, we lost a lot of great writers.
So going, you know, going back into this literary movement, into your coming of age with it, into your exposure to some North American voices like Ginsberg and the others we've talked about. I want to touch on the immigrant experience because just for the North Americans, it's there. People like Ginsberg, there is an immigrant experience. But for us, it's even more poignant. For all of the Nuyorican crew, for all of the Puerto Ricans in New York. So how does, you know, how have you foregrounded? How have you, you know, pushed that immigrant experience in your own poems? Is it the language dichotomies, the code switching, or is it the actual, you know, content of the pieces? Where is the immigrant subjectivity in your poetry?
Well, I have in one of the thing about the immigrant's tale, you know, of being pushed out of the homeland because of political and terrorism, in this case, American terrorism in Puerto Rico, you know, and coming here where it's another state of mind when you're in New York City compared to being in Rincon or Mayaguez or San Juan. It's a different state of mind. Even the time and the rhythm is different, etc. But um, the whole immigrant experience is that we're always returning home like a swell in the ocean. We're always, and like Neruda says, one of the things about the swelling of the ocean is that the swells not only want to hit the seashore, but they want to stay home. They don't want to be disconnected and go back into the ocean. And Puerto Ricans are like that, you know. Wherever we go, we're always going to be Boricuas because we have this identity issue between the cultural war between English and Spanish and values that are Americanized versus, you know, authentic Boricuaness, etc. So we even had to prove among ourselves how Puerto Rican we are. In fact, I even wrote a poem called Puerto Ricans for Beginners, you know, because many people don't know the role that we played in defending America from 1917 all the way down, all these wars that we fought, willingly or not, or forced to protect this country. And yet, why does America refuse to be a little bit more brown? Because we're not a colored people, we're colorful. And our rhythms, our music, and our culture has made this country into a beautiful empire. But we're not here to serve the empire. We're here to liberate our own minds, you know, and by not being invisible to our culture and our history and our literature.
I wanna cross pollinate that with the fact that, you know, most people know you as a poet, Jose Angel, but you have written prose, you have written plays, you have written children's literature, you even have a jazz opera. So I would like you to just bring to our attention at least one of your non-poetic incursions. Tell us about one of those forays into the world outside of poetry.
Well, first of all, besides jazz that I always play while I'm writing, and sometimes some of the poems are born as a result of listening to jazz, whether it's Miles Davis or Coltrane, etc. And I go with the flow, you know. because the blank page is not just a blank page. It's a place where your thoughts fly into, and you get these whispers that keep coming to you. And you have to write this down because these poetic whispers, so we're like, we're always listening to those voices that come with the inner wisdom or intuition in our lives. And they're giving you all these little messages that come in poetic imagery and metaphors. And if you don't write them down, you get lost in the river of your thoughts. That immigrant experience, Minna Nieves has a poem called Migratory Dreams, which I like. And it shows you that no matter where you are, we're universal vagabonds. We're always time traveling, and the place that we love to be into is the backyards of our imagination, because we're always observing and absorbing. And that's where I feel the migratory or immigrant theme comes in. We're time travelers. And so you don't have to go to Puerto Rico. I can sleepwalk and be in Puerto Rico, because those memories are so strong of our roots in Puerto Rico and the roots of a tree that talk to each other. That's what poets do. We use our poetry to go beyond the roots of trees and engulf fresh wind and, be at peace with nature. Be at peace with nature. What keeps it all going, of course, is the chaos and the political spectrum of who we are, and what do our voices mean in this very complicated world. For that reason, becoming an educational facilitator at Boricua College allows me to work with young people, because we got to keep up with the mindset and heartbeats of young people. And that's what keeps me fresh, to listen to the way they talk, and it's not about being more or less Puerto Rican or Afrocentric. It's they come from another world of social media that's totally different from ours. When we had to go into our roots, we listened to, Tito Rodriguez, Tito Puente, the troubadours of Puerto Rico, Ramito, Chuito. I mean, I could go on, because those are people that are, they're the rhythms of our heartbeats here. And that's where the book, Heartbeats, Rhythms, and Fire came from. It's 3 distinct journeys, not one book, like Ulysses and Homer. So the first one is Heartbeats, about our relationship to nature and life. Rhythms is our movement, our movement, and then fire is our passions, things that we stand for or stand against, so that's where you get the political poems in fire, and so on.
And now that you're mentioning that, and that you just mentioned your job as a facilitator, I mean, your vocation rather, as a facilitator in Boricua College, where we met 20 years ago, I feel this is a metaphor for the job of teaching in college, for facilitating heartbeats, rhythm, and fire. The way you've described it, I want to know, does your performative, fire, your performative sort of energy, does it spill over into the classroom, into your facilitating experience? Does some of that incantatory poet, shaman energy go into the classroom as well?
Yes, because I tell students, listen, you're all actors. You just don't know what script you're in,
Hey.
And I love the language that they come, with, that goes beyond being street smart, because the whole thing about being in the classroom today, my time was about opportunity, mobility, and competition, because we were never good enough, and we were not supposed to survive. So in my time, educational attainment, whether you got a college degree, is making a transition from having a job, J-O-B, jerks of bosses, to becoming a professional, specializing in something. And that's why I've been in, teaching for over 50 years, because we need to prepare the next generation and the generation after that to make sure that they know our literature, because you'll be amazed, and you're a professor yourself and an artist, that they don't know this literature. If I say Don Ricardo Alegría or Miri Baraka, they don't know who I'm talking about. If I say Piri Thomas, and we're talking about the 60s. So this literature has not been introduced in the classroom. And that's always been the concern of many cultural visionaries and artists, to make sure that we bring that literature, our literature, into the classroom, right, including Afrocentric literature, because it's about them. So what I do is I introduce them to the history and their culture through poetics, theater, film, which I use, documentaries, and even martial arts. Sometimes I do martial arts with my students because of the discipline of your body language, and so on. All that I incorporate with photography and with music. So it's a multimedia approach to creative writing, and I have them write their own stories. So once I teach them the elements of poetry, the elements of prose, etc., then I say, okay, now you're going to showcase by writing a story about a paradigm shift about your life and how you made your transformation. Why? Because the greatest teacher is survival. But if you don't write down what's happened to you, how are you going to articulate and communicate that to your children? So I encourage them to read their books and our history and get away from Netflix and Walt Disney, because that's not about them. Even that In the Heights stuff is sort of like a modern day version of Walt Disney, because we're so colorful and playful with our music. But when it comes to fighting for our beliefs and our values, then we become radicals and militants, you see? So the literature, that's one of the reasons why I love being at Boricua College, because I get this opportunity to work with young people, to be innovative in the classroom, not as a professor, but as a lover of language and the humanities. And when they see my passion for writing and theater, because, Boricuas are natural born show-offs anyway, they're gossipologists, bochinchero, but they always have a beautiful story to tell. And most important, they have a triumphant spirit. And that's what I see in young people. We need to prepare the next generation so that they don't feel like they're still landing in New York City with chancletas, They've been here. They've been great contributors to the American so-called dream, but also they're part of the American nightmare, And that's what I learned from Miri Baraka and P.D. Thomas, that, in order to stay alive, you have to document your story, but refuse to stay down and stay invisible. And that's my immigrant experience, because we are a work in progress as immigrants.
And that's why I liked In the Heights. I actually saw the film. I saw the play and I saw the film, and I really enjoyed that triumphal spirit. I think it's reflected in the Puerto Rican, the Dominican, and the Cuban thing of In the Heights, because like Boricua College, it also brings together not just the Boricuas, which we care immensely about, pero los Dominicanos y other Latin Americans. And I find that New York is important to me, at least, because of that melting pot of Caribbean voices, and which I know you're a part of, because you've been in the scene since the 70s, seeing how our Puerto Rican thing has gotten enriched by the Dominican thing, by the Cuban thing, which has been there forever. So yeah, I enjoyed the trend.
And not only that, hip hop brings in, and reggaeton brings in a new element that comes from young people, and all that. Amir and I used to listen to a lot of these rap poets at the beginning and say, they sound cool, but they're illiterate, because you could see in the poetry and the structure, they keep repeating refrains, but there's nothing else about that. It's all about the beat. Boom, doom, 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 ba. All this. I say, okay, I could work with that. But if the poetry and the substance of the poetry is just about gyrating and sexuality and quítate la panty music, which we used to call reggaeton at the beginning, then that's all superficial and sexist. And that's another issue that we have to explore in our literature, about feminism and sexism. We have to explore those issues about how we deal with those issues at home. So those are important issues so that the next generation is empowered, to create their own stories. And that has been my life task, Miguel, to make sure that young bloods have a voice, that they write poetry. And I'm proud to say that many of my students have become professional writers and published. That to me is a milestone, you see? And I'm going to do this until my last breath, because people say, when are you going to retire? Retire for what? An OD on Netflix, and take a tour around my neighborhood because I can't go back home? Get out of here. No. Work with young people because we need to share our gifts and our history and pass it on like the old aretos. We have that responsibility as artists to pass our gifts to the young. And hopefully they will do something better than we did.
No,
and I'm sure they will.
And I sympathize, but what I find most compelling is that you have been doing that effortlessly. You have been doing that, tú sabes, in smooth continuum that involves your persona as a poet, your privacy when you're composing, listening to your jazz, your work as a facilitator, and when you bring those students to the experiential, mode in Boricua College. So I really appreciate the plug, but what I really respect is that the plug is not like an artificial, let's do the youth, but it's an all-encompassing persona that José Angel Figueroa, has been, nurturing for 30, 40 years. I mean, since as long as I have known you back in the 2001.
Yeah, but that's the other thing, that our artists have always been, in many ways, cultural visionary and activists.
Yes.
Because if you don't connect your art with the history and needs of your community, then what's your purpose? To be a superstar, to be a celebrity, to be on America's Got Talent, so we need to connect our gifts and how we build community, because our community needs our voices as scholars, as professors, as artists. So it's not just about teaching or writing or facilitating. It's about helping to generate a new community, and because the arts is a healing process. It's not just politics. Poetry is a healing process where you explore and discover your multitudes, your temperament, your voices, your emotional intelligence. And that's what I do in the classroom. I help students as learners become scholars, because we're all learners, but strive to be a scholar. Why? Because academic excellence for me is not a grade, it's an attitude. But we have to use our interpersonal skills as activists and as artists to work with young people, because without them, we don't have a future. And that's where my passion lies. That's how I stay young. That's how I stay young, working with young people. They give me so much faith and hope. I really love what I do. And it's not about your salary or your status, no. That, I'm beyond all that. Way back when, is knowing why you were born. And the purpose of the artist is not only to uplift and educate, but also to create good trouble, to create good rebels who are not into the status quo, and could be critical thinkers. And we need critical thinkers, because that's what artists do. They're critical thinkers, and poetry is one of the most beautiful forms that have shaped the history of Puerto Rico. Like I said earlier, from Rodriguez de Tio, Lola Rodriguez, to Julia de Burgos, and so on, poets have always been part of the revolutionary struggles of Puerto Rico. you know. So what I do is I hope that people can get this on Instagram or Amazon, electronic books, all this in both paperback and, you know, hardcover. And I often say, if we don't promote our own work, who's going to promote it? So this is not about your ego. This is about make sure that the hard work that you've done stays alive. You know what Rimbaud said that fascinated me? Rimbaud said, I would gladly trade 100 readers today to know that I have one reader 100 years from now.
Wow.
That hit me. I said, oh, wow. So I keep saying, listen, students, if I have 15, 20 years to my life, I'm okay. I did my thing. I'm happy. You know, I don't believe in death. I believe in transformation, you know. And so you call it resurrection, whatever, you know. I believe that there's always another life beyond and before this one, because I knew what my purpose in this world was, to use my poetic gifts to educate, you know, so that we deal with our higher consciousness of introspection, and we connect with our community. That's what the artists do best, when they connect with the needs of the community and so on. So this is a way of keeping the literature alive. And I said to my students, I may not be here in 20 years, but every time you read my poetry, I come back to earth.
Well, and with that in mind, and after that, you know, what you said resonates. It's so beautiful. I would like to ask you, as a way to end this tertulia, I would like to ask you to read something from Heartbeats, Rhythms, and Fire, which I hope some of the people that are watching this tertulia can get in Amazon or wherever they get good books. And why don't we start with the beginning, so then people can follow? Why don't we read one of the early selections from Heartbeats? If you would do us the honor, Jose Angel, would you kindly read for us, perhaps?
I like to read the first poem, Black Pearl, that opens up the book to Heartbeats, Rhythms, and Fire. And it goes like this. Heart-shaped Africa is the axis of my ancestral roots. I am a black pearl mixed with the dust of a violet moon and brown sugar babies, baptized in fire. My rose purple lips praise the faith of my great, great, great grandmothers, whose sweet, salty, and pungent heartstrings never cracked when singing the black folks' blues. My voice is the bitter cry of many oceans and crossroads. My tears are uprooted trees, longing to return to sacred fire water. My soul is entombed with the allure of lavender pouring from the gifts of dawn. I have torn down that massive veil which made me feel my existence was once a problem. I will not bend, be harnessed, kept silent, be forbidden to bear my own fruits or to dance with the constellations. My thunderous heart will turn white sparks into a hot glare. My story will be told without the putrid disgust of hatred. Africa did not make an outcast out of me. Why does my blackness still petrify you? Am I not the first daughter of the night? I am a black pearl mixed with the dust of a violet moon and brown sugar babies baptized in fire.
Thank you, Jose Angel. Thank you. That was incredible. Thanks to all of you that are watching
Gracias,
us.
hermano.
Heartbeats, rhythms, and fire.
From Rich Sugarcane Press.
Yes.
Edith
Thank
Morales. Love you.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches y gracias. Una